Just note allowed to speak without permission from your puppet master. Shiskar hand reached out, fingers shovering inches from the guard's chest. Let's see what happens if we pull your strings. The older veteran took a half step forward, but his companion caught this arm. Both men had seen enough combat to recognize that this situation was balanced on a knife's edge. The guard's stillness wasn't weakness. It was the controlled patience of a trained soldier assessing a threat. You stand here day after day. Thor continued, his voice taking on an edge of genuine anger now, as if the guard's composed silence was a personal insult, looking down on people like me, thinking your fancy uniform makes you better than Ush's baton. The ground near the guard's polished boots. But I know men like you take away the costume, and what's left nothing but another man who bleeds like everyone else. The evening air had grown colder, but it wasn't the temperature that made several onlookers shiver. There was something in his bearing now, a coiled tension that spoke of imminent violence. His fingers flexed at his sides, scarred knuckles whitening as his mock. Carrie began to transform into something more dangerous. Tell you what he said, taking another step closer. Why don't we find out what's real under all this pageantry? His hand moved toward the guard's chest, where polished metals caught the dying light. Let's see what happens when we pull back the curtain on this little performance. Thorn's hand reached out, fingers grasping the first metal on the guard's chest. Nice collection of tiny you've got there. Hesneered, deliberately rattling the military decorations. What did you do to earn it? He sustained really still for aerially. Longtime Themetal Siege 1 representing acts of valor in combat zones across the world. Clinked together under Thorn's rough-handed Link campaign, medals earned in Afghanistan's harsh terrain, commendations for bravery, under fire tokens of sacrifice that had been paid for in blood and sweat, all now subject to the disrespect of a man who couldn't comprehend their true weight. Look at this one. Thorn continued, flicking a particular metal with his scarred finger. Probably bought it at a costume shop, didn't you? His other hand reached up to grasp the collar of the scarlet tunic, the pristine fabric crumpling under his gripple of this just dress a playing soldier. While real men do real work, the guard's eyes remained forward, his posture unwavering, but there was a dangerous stillness in his bearing. Now it wasn't the stillness of ceremony, but the contained readiness of a predator, the kind of stillness that combat veterans would recognize as preceding swift and decisive action. What's this uniform made of anyway? Thorn's fingers moved to the fabric, deliberately wrinkling the meticulously pressed tunic. Feels cheap to him. Alike everything else about this act, the tugged at the material, a sound of threading stretching, reaching the ears of horrified onlookers. The veterans watched with increasing tension, their own military experience telling them this was quickly moving beyond mere disrespect. The older one's hand had moved from his medals to his side. Where years ago a service weapon would have rested, his companion's face had hardened into the expression of a man calculating odds and angles, old habits from battlefield days rising to the surface even. These buttons. Thorn continued, running his hand roughly across the brass fixtures, smearing their mirror-like shine with his fingerprints. All for show, just like you. His voice had taken on a darker edge, the mockery becoming more physical with each passing moment. Standing here like some statue while I mess up your pretty costume, can't do anything about it, can you? The guard's ceremonial or rifle hadn't moved, but its presence seemed more significant. The weapon, while maintaining its traditional position, somehow carried a new weight in the tension-filled air. Those who knew their military history might have remembered that these guards were all combat-trained soldiers, and their rifles, while ceremonial, were far from props. Maybe we should see what's under Earth's fancy hat. Thorn's hand moved upward, reaching for the bearskin cap. Bet it's not even real, from cheap. The guard's stance shifted ever so slightly, a movement so subtle that only the veterans noticed it. But it was enough to make Thorn pause, his hand hovering inches from the bearskin for a fraction of a second. Something primal in him recognized the warning signs that his conscious mind was too arrogant to process. But the moment passed, and his sneer turned. What's wrong? To a soldier worried. I'll mess up your costume. His hand dropped to the rifle's bar, rel fingers strailing along the metal with deliberate provocation. Wonder what would happen if someone decided to take your little prop away. Bet that would ruin the whole show. Wouldn't it? His fingers wrapped around the rifle's barrel, the metal coal against this scarred handle. Let's find out just how real any of this is, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. To show everyone what happens when you pull back the curtain on this little. Sure, everything happened in an instant. Thorn's fingers tightened around the rifle's barrel, his muscles tensing. Foe. A sudden yank to expose this hole. The guard moved with the fluid precision of a cobra strike. Years of combat training transformed ceremonial stance into lethal efficiency in a heartbeat. The rifle, far from being the prop Thorn had mockingly assumed, became a weapon in hands of its master. With a swift, controlled motion, The guard pivoted their rifles buttoned upward, catching Thorn squarely in the solar plexus. The crack of wood against flesh out across the courtyard like a thunderclap, followed by Thorn's startled jest past the air rushed from his lung. She staggered backward, eyes wide with shock and disbelief. The arrogance near vanished, replaced by the dawning realization that he had severely miscalculated. His boots scraped against the courtyard stones as she struggled to maintain his balance, one hand clutching his midsection where the rifle's impact had left its message. You can't. Thorn wheezed, trying to reclaim his tough guy persona. Even as fought for breath. That's assault, but the words carried now weight. Now not after his own actions had been witnessed by dozens of onlookers. The guard had already resumed his ceremonial stance, the rifle back in its proper position. His movements so precise, it almost seemed like he had never moved at all, but there was something different in his bearing now, a lethal readiness visible to anyone who knew what to look for. The two veterans exchanged knowing glances, recognizing the controlled power of a trained soldier who had issued a clear warning. Thorn straightened slowly, his face flushing red with a dangerous mixture of humiliation and rage. His prison-hardened ego couldn't accept the fact that his attempt to demonstrate power had backfired so spectacularly. The guard's swift response had not only caused him physical pain, but had shattered his illusion of superiority. Think you're tough, do you? Thorn's voice was raspy, but the threat in it had doubled. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, knuckle to two, stretching across whitened skin. That was a lucky shot. Let's see how you handle Ariel fight. The guard remained motionless, but his stillness now carried a different quality, not the rigidity of ceremony, but the readiness of a warrior. His eyes still fixed forward seemed to hold calculation of someone who had faced far worse threats in real combat zones. I'm going to take that rifle, Thorn announced, his voice carrying the desperate famine whose pride demanded violence. And show everyone here what a joke you really are. He shifted his weight, preparing to lung. His prison yard experience had taught them the value of surprise, but they failed to recognize he was no longer dealing with an ordinary opponent. Several tourists backed away quickly, sensing the impending violence. A mother hurried her children behind a stone pillar, while others reached for their phones, not to record but a call for help. The veterans stood their ground, their own combat experience telling them this situation was about to escalate significantly. Thorn's muscles tensed as she prepared to spring forward. Time to end this little game. Of the bearing shifted almost imperceptibly, but the change was profound. Gone was any pretense of ceremonial duty. This was now a combat-trained soldier responding to a clear threat. The rifle, while maintaining its formal position, was now held with the subtle readiness that spoke of years of battlefield experience. A wise man would have recognized the warning signs, a smart man would have backed down, but Thorn, driven by wounded pride, Ian Dalef, time of solving problems with violence, was neither wise nor smart. In that moment, his body coiled like a spring, preparing for what he thought would be eight-rin fan demonstration of his superiority over this toy soldier. What he failed to understand as she gathered himself for another attack was that he had crossed a line that separated ceremonial practice from deadly serious reality. The guard's next response would drive that lesson home in a way that Noon Present would ever forget. Thorn launched himself forward with the desperate speed of a man with nothing to lose, his boots scraping against the courtyard stones as she charged. Prison yard instincts guided his movements, fast, aggressive, committed to overwhelming his target through sheer brutality. But before he could complete his second step, the sound of gunfire cracked across the palace grounds. The guard had moved with practiced efficiency, the ceremonial rifle rising to firing position in one fluid motion. The warning shot split the evening air like thunder, echoing off the palace walls with authority that no amount of ceremony could match. The smell of gunpowder cut through the cool air, sharp and real and utterly serious. Thorn froze mid-stride, his body locked in position, like a statue, a cruel irony given his earlier mock. Aria's face, previously contorted with rage, now displayed something entirely different, pure primal fear, the realization that the rifle was very real, very functional, and in the hands of someone who knew exactly how to use it. Hit him like a physical blow. Don't move. The guard's voice carried the steel of combat command, each word precise and laden with deadly promise. His rifle remained trained with unwavering steadiness, the barrel now seeming to Thorn like the entrance to every dark future. Thorn's hands rose slowly into the air, his fingers trembling, not meant the cold, but from the sudden terrifying understanding of just how badly he had misjudged the situation. The tough prison cracked completely, revealing the coward that often lurks beneath such aggressive exteriors. I didn't, stammered, all pretense of toughness evaporating like morning mist. The man who had been so eager to demonstrate his power now looked pathetically small against the backdrop of Buckingham Palace. The guard's bearing had transformed, completely gone was any trace of ceremonial duty. This was a combat veteran responding to a Thor. Eat with practiced precision, his stances spoke of years of battlefield experience, each subtle movement calibrated for maximum efficiency on your knees. The guard commanded his carrying the kind of authority that bypasses conscious thought and triggers immediate compliance. It was the voice of someone who had issued similar commands in situations where lives hung in the balance. Thorn dropped to his knees so quickly that the impact rattled his teeth. His palms remained raised, fingers spread wide, desperate to show submission's wet beaded on his fore. Despite the cool evening air running down to sting his eyes, the two veterans watched with grim satisfaction, recognizing in the guard's response the kind of disciplined force they had known in their own service days. This wasn't theatrical display. This was their face of military training, revealed only when circumstances demanded. The rifle you were so eager to test, the guard's voice carried across the now silent courtyard, has been used in active combat zones. Just like the man holding it, the subtle shift in his stances volumes to those who understood such things. This uniform, you mocked, it's been worn in places where respect isn't a choice. It's the difference between life and death. The evening air seemed to vibrate with tension as approaching sirens announced the arrival of authorities, but noon moved. Noon spoke. The table all held the guard standing rigid and ready, Thorn kneeling in trembling submission, and the crowd watching in stunned silence as reality stripped away all pretense. Armed police officers swarmed into the courtyard. Their movements precise and coordinated, they took in the scene with professional efficiency. The kneeling suspect the guard's combat stance, the stunned crowd. Now words needed to be exchanged. The situation spoke for itself. Armed policista. Down, the lead officer's command was almost redundant. Thorn hadn't moved a muscle since the warning shot had shattered his world of assumptions. As they approached with handcuffs ready, his shoulders slumped in final defeat, the guard lowered his rifle with military precision, resuming his ceremonial stance, as if the entire incident had been nothing more than a momentary interruption of duty. But the crowd had seen behind the curtain of ceremony, had witnessed the steel beneath the tradition as the officer secured Thorn's wrists behind his back. One of them addressed the guard with professional courtesy, tinged with respect. "We'll need a statement, sir. This is a serious offense, attempting to disarm a member of the Queen's Guard." The older veteran stepped forward, his campaign medal skin the last rays of sunlight. Everything officer dealt provocation, physical contact with the guard. Attempt to seize a military weapon. The guard showed remarkable restraint. His companion nodded. Gravely, "Could have been much worse in my day. Anyone trying to grab a guard's rifle would have gotten more than just a warning shot, though." Now thoroughly subdued, Wash helped to his feet. The swagger was gone. The tough guy persona shattered his eyes. Couldn't meet anyone's gaze as the officers began to lead him away. Each step seemed to carry the weight of his humiliation. "You never know, do you?" one tourist whispered to another, all this time thinking they were just there for show. The guard had already resumed his post, his posture perfect, eyes forward, ceremonial duty restored. But there was something different now in how the crowd regarded him. The tourists who had been taking casual photos earlier now tooted a respectful distance, their expressions thoughtful. A young boy tugged at his father's sleeve. "That why they say never to touch the guards." The father nodded solemnly. "They're real soldiers. And everything about Ms. Real, the uniform, the rifle, the training, what we see is just the surface of their duty." As Thorn disappeared into a waiting police vehicle, the older veteran approached the guard's position. Didn't speak, didn't need to. Instead, he drew himself to attention and offered a crisp salute. Soldier to soldier, warrior to warrior. The gestures spoke volumes about mutual understanding and respect. The guard stood motionless. Some more, the scarlet eunuch pristine, the bearskin cap perfectly on the rifle held in ceremonial position. But no, one would mistake this former ceremony again in an age where tradition of 10 faces mockery and ceremony is dismissed as mere performance. The day's events served as a stark reminder the Queen's Guards stand as living embodiments of values that run deeper than their ceremonial duties, suggest honor, discipline, and the readiness to act when those values are threatened. For those who wondered why these guards maintain their stoic presence day after day, the answer had been demonstrated with crystal clarity. They stand not just as guardians of a palace, but as defenders of principles that have weathered centuries of challenges. Their ceremonial duty masks a core of steel. Their practiced discipline contains capabilities that few would wish to test. The next time you visit Buckingham Palace and see the guards standing their watch, remember this: behind every pristine uniform beats the heart of a warrior. Each polished button, each precise movement, each moment of ceremonial stillness represents years of training and dedication. Their silence isn't weakness, it's the quiet strength of men who know exactly what they recapable of and choose to serve with dignity rather than display what would you do if faced with such blatant disrespect. How far should tradition bend before steel must show through? Perhaps the real question isn't why these guards stand so still, but rather what it takes to make the move, and whether anyone would truly want to find out the guard's stance remained perfect. As darkness settled over London, his duty unchanged by the days. After all, that's what real strength looks like, not in the ability to provoke a response, but in the discipline to stand watching, waiting, protecting values that will outlast any who dare to challenge them.